Gettysburg, in July of 1863 on a hill in Pennsylvania, more than 50,000 men clashed over 3 days of intense fighting, and when the smoke finally cleared, the grass was soaked with blood so thick that witnesses said the very earth seemed to weep with sorrow for those who fell. Gettysburg, the bloodiest battle of the American Civil War, left behind not just bodies and graves, but something else. Something indefinable yet unmistakable that park rangers still report to this day, decades after the last cannon fell silent and the screaming stopped. The battlefield itself has become a place where time seems to stutter and break down, where the past refuses to stay buried beneath the earth, and where visitors experience phenomena that defy explanation with anything resembling conventional logic or rational science. Over 10,000 soldiers, some claim, still haunt these grounds, their voices trapped in the rocks and trees, their footsteps echoing endlessly through Valley of Death, and their anguish pressed into the very soil beneath the grass in ways that seem to persist across generations and years. Park rangers have reported crying babies in old buildings where no children live, the smell of tobacco smoke in empty rooms where no one is smoking, and footsteps that march through corridors at night, always at the same pace, always stopping at the same places as if following an invisible routine established over 150 years ago and never wavering. Photographs malfunction without reason. Cameras die. Digital equipment fails in locations that should pose no technical difficulty whatsoever, leading some paranormal investigators to theorize that whatever haunts Gettysburg actively interferes with and resists attempts to document it photographically. Some visitors report seeing figures in uniform, soldiers in gray and blue standing at attention on ridges where they fell. And when approached, these figures simply vanish. Not running, not fading, but gone instantly, as if they were never there at all. The Devil's Den, a rocky outcropping on the southern ridge, is particularly active with reported paranormal phenomena. Sharpshooters once fired from these stones with deadly accuracy, and their presence lingers so powerfully that visitors report seeing apparitions in tattered uniforms, hearing disembodied rebel yells that sound agonized and desperate, and experiencing camera failures that seasoned ghost hunters cannot explain with any rational framework or scientific understanding. Some claim that no camera, no matter how advanced or well-maintained, will function properly within Triangular Field, just northwest of the Den, where hundreds have reported apparitions of Confederate soldiers crawling through the grass, their bodies suspended in motion, reliving their final moments forever in an endless loop. Witnesses describe sensations of being watched, of pressure on their chests as if hands are pushing them, of voices whispering names they've never heard, of sudden temperature drops that occur without meteorological cause. Whether these are genuine manifestations of trapped spirits unable to move beyond their place of death, emotional imprints left by mass trauma so profound it altered the very nature of reality itself, or something else entirely remains a mystery. But Gettysburg remains America's most haunted battlefield, a place where the dead seem to walk as freely as the living. Antietam. On September 17, 1862, two armies collided in the cornfields and creek beds of Maryland, and in a single day, 23,000 men were wounded, killed, or simply vanished into history without explanation or proper account of their fates. Antietam holds the grim distinction of being the bloodiest single day of combat in American history, a record that has remained unbroken for over 160 years despite numerous subsequent conflicts. And it was a battle so violent, so shocking in its brutality, that those who survived spoke of it only in whispers, as if the sheer number of deaths had burned their names into the landscape itself, creating spiritual scars that would never fully heal. Today, visitors to Antietam National Park report phenomena as consistent and haunting as the bat. Tall itself was relentless and merciless in its execution and violence. Bloody Lane, a sunken road where soldiers died by the thousands in horrifying conditions, remains peculiarly quiet, unnaturally so in ways that make the hair on visitors' necks stand on end. And visitors describe a church-like silence that persists no matter how many people walk the path, as if the ground itself has absorbed the capacity for normal sound and movement. Yet that silence is broken by sounds no one can identify or explain with reasonable confidence. The crack of musket fire at night when no reenactors are present, voices calling out in agony and desperation, and one detail that has convinced skeptics to reconsider their positions and beliefs. The sound of what witnesses describe as a Gaelic chant, a rhythmic singing that echoes across the fields near where the Irish Brigade made their doomed charge during the battle. A group of students from Baltimore visited the battlefield on a school trip and heard what they described as Christmas caroling, the words sounding like fa la 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 in unmistakable repetition. And their teacher, an expert on Civil War history with decades of accumulated knowledge, was completely baffled because those sounds matched precisely with the Gaelic battle cries that the Irish Brigade would have screamed as they charged across those same fields over a century before the students' visit. The coincidence is so precise, so inexplicable that some have theorized the screams of that charge were recorded not in history books, but in the very fabric of the place itself, echoing forward in time for anyone sensitive enough to listen and perceive. One visitor famously encountered a man in a Confederate uniform walking Bloody Lane in perfect clarity and broad daylight, and believing him to be a reenactor, passed without comment, only to look back moments later and find the figure had completely vanished without a trace or sound. There was no reenactment that day, no permit filed, no other visitors in the immediate area. The battlefield, soaked in blood and grief, holds its secrets, and whether those secrets are paranormal manifestations or deeply buried psychological imprints remains a question that may never be fully answered. Culloden Moor. On April 16, 1746, in Scotland, a young man called Bonnie Prince Charlie led 6,000 Jacobites against a well-supplied government army equipped with modern artillery and tactics. And in the span of just 1 hour, the moorland was transformed into a graveyard where hope died as definitively as the soldiers themselves. Nearly 1,500 Jacobites fell that day, their bodies piled into mass graves across the moor in hasty and disrespectful burial arrangements that many believe denied them the proper rights and respect they deserved. And the British Crown gained a victory that would echo through Scottish history as the final crushing of the old way, the end of the clans, and the beginning of an era of suppression and silence that lasted generations. But the silence of Culloden is not the silence of peace or rest or spiritual contentment. It is something far darker, far more active. And on the anniversary of the battle each year, locals and visitors report experiencing phenomena that suggest the spirits trapped on that moor are still fighting, still dying, still screaming in a battle that will never end, unable or unwilling to accept their defeat. The anniversary, April 16th, brings with it consistent accounts of ghostly armies rising from the earth, the cries of the wounded that sound anguished and desperate, the clashing of steel against shield, and gunfire that echoes across empty ground where nothing is firing, as if the battle replays itself eternally, year after year. A lone Jacobite soldier dressed in his clan tartan and moving with the gait of Tiwi, he defeated, is reported wandering the moor muttering, "Defeated, defeated," over and over again, as if the loss has broken something fundamental in his spirit, shattering his identity beyond any possibility of recovery or redemption. There are also reports of the great Culloden Scree, a black bird of enormous size that appears in the mist, which local tradition identifies as the spirit of Lord George Murray, the Jacobite commander. And this bird has been seen by multiple independent witnesses across decades, each describing the same dark form emerging from fog, bringing with it a palpable sense of doom and ancient loss. Temperature variations inexplicably occur near the mass grave sites, dropping suddenly and without any meteorological cause that can be detected or measured by instruments. Can visitors report disembodied screams, poltergeist activity with objects moving without explanation, and the sound of many armed men marching, the phantom tread of an army that lost everything and cannot rest, condemned to march eternally. Some residents report being awakened in the early morning hours by the sound of an armed force passing by their homes, only to find nothing when they look outside, leaving them with a sense of unease that lingers for weeks afterward. Towton. In 1461, during the Wars of the Roses, roughly 30,000 men died on a snowy field in England, making it one of the largest and bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil. And the battle was so fierce, so overwhelming in its brutality, that the very weather seems to have conspired to mark it in history as something that should never be forgotten by the living. Towton is known for a peculiar phenomenon that has been documented by locals for centuries with remarkable consistency. Every 7 years without fail, a massive snowstorm returns to the area in precise cycles that cannot be explained by meteorological patterns alone, defying all attempts at scientific explanation. According to local legend passed down through generations and recorded in local archives, if one Ventu rests into that storm and reaches the battlefield, The two armies can be witnessed fighting their desperate battle once again, replaying their violence for approximately 3 hours before vanishing into the snow as if they never existed. Whether this is a temporal anomaly that allows past events to bleed through into the present, a collective hallucination triggered by suggestion and the power of atmosphere, or something genuinely paranormal that defies rational explanation, remains the central unsolved mystery of Towton. More recently, a group of paranormal researchers conducted an all-night investigation on the battlefield and reported being followed by an unseen presence that felt intelligent and aware of their investigation, hearing the sound of a horse's hooves striking the ground. Repeatedly with a rhythmic cadence, and experiencing such overwhelming unease that they were profoundly relieved to see dawn arrive and banish the darkness. Before leaving the site, they took a selfie photograph to document their presence on the battlefield, and when they reviewed the image later at home, they discovered something that shattered their sense of reality and forced them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the nature of haunted locations. In the background of their smiling faces was the unmistakable figure of a man on horseback, clearly visible in perfect photographic focus, wearing clothing that suggested he belonged to the 15th century without question or doubt. The man was not there when they took the photograph. They had carefully checked the area before clicking the shutter. No reenactors were present on that date. No witnesses saw anyone else on the battlefield in the immediate vicinity. Yet the image persists, documented and thoroughly unexplainable despite extensive investigation, suggesting that the battlefield captured something that the human eye could not perceive in the moment, but that photographic equipment somehow registered, implying multiple layers of reality existing simultaneously. Thermopylae. In 480 BCE, 300 Spartan warriors and their allies made their legendary stand against the Persian army in a narrow mountain pass. And though they were slaughtered to the last man, their defiance echoed through 25 centuries of history, inspiring courage and defiance in ways that few military actions ever have achieved. But the ancient battlefields of Greece, unlike the American Civil War sites, present a different kind of haunting. One rooted not in recent trauma, but in the accumulated weight of millennia upon the landscape, creating layers of spiritual and emotional residue that seem to deepen with each passing century. Thermopylae, the narrow pass where the Spartans held their position and refused to yield despite overwhelming odds stacked against them, is reported by modern visitors to be a place where time feels strange and distorted, where the air carries a weight that is difficult to describe in words, and where the connection to the past feels unusually vivid and present in ways that defy rational explanation. Visitors report overwhelming sensations of honor, duty, and sacrifice, as if the emotions of those ancient warriors have been absorbed into the very rocks and earth, becoming part of the geological structure itself, woven into its essence. Some claim to hear distant battle sounds, the clash of spear and shield, the cries of dying men who refused to retreat, though no explanation can be found for these auditory phenomena at all. And some investigators suggest that the pass itself may act as a kind of acoustic chamber that preserves the sounds of history eternally. The sensation of being watched is reported consistently by visitors from all backgrounds, as is the feeling that the eyes that watch are not hostile or malevolent, but sorrowful and contemplative, bearing the weight of an ancient grief that has never been properly acknowledged or mourned by the wider world. Whether Thermopylae is truly haunted by the spirits of those Spartans, or whether ancient places simply carry the weight of human history in ways that our minds interpret as paranormal remains unclear and hotly debated. But the consistency of reports from visitors spanning decades suggests that something real and measurable is happening at this location. Stalingrad. The city now called Volgograd was the site of the most brutal battle of World War II, a grinding urban warfare campaign that killed over 2 million soldiers and civilians in the course of several devastating months. And the devastation was so complete, the death toll so astronomical, that some believe entire sections of the city are haunted by the ghosts left behind in the rubble and destroyed buildings. Residents of Volgograd have reported seeing apparitions in World War II-era uniforms, both Soviet and German soldiers, walking through neighborhoods and appearing on streets with a kind of purposeful determination, their presence suggesting they are unable to accept the reality of their deaths or incapable of moving beyond the location where they fell and were buried. Entire neighborhoods are said to be hotspots for paranormal activity, with families experiencing unexplained phenomena in their homes. Furniture moving without cause, doors opening on their own as if invisible hands are operating them. Cold spots appearing suddenly in the midst of warm rooms, and the overwhelming sense of not being alone in spaces where they live. A former German field hospital located near the site is particularly active with reported phenomena, with visitors and staff reporting the sounds of wounded soldiers crying out in distress, voices crying out in pain and agony, and the overwhelming sensation of a medical emergency and suffering that never ends, as if the trauma of wartime medicine is imprinted eternally into the very structure of the building. Volgograd State University stands on ground that was soaked in blood and human suffering during the siege, and students and faculty have reported ghostly encounters with invisible entities, shadows moving in empty rooms during broad daylight, and the persistent feeling of being watched by those who died in the soil beneath the building's foundation, suggesting that the spirits remain deeply anchored to this place and unable to move on. Dieppe. On August 19, 1942, the Allies launched Operation Jubilee, a raid on the French port city of Dieppe, and the mission turned into a catastrophic failure that cost the lives of nearly 3,000 soldiers out of the 6,000 who landed on the beach in what many consider one of the worst military disasters of the entire war. The sand of Dieppe, it is said, will never fully wash clean of the blood spilled that day in such horrifying abundance. And visitors to the beach report seeing lonely figures trudging through the sand in the hours near dusk, solitary souls who seem unable to escape the location of their deaths or unwilling to leave the place where they fell and died. Ghost sightings occur primarily along the beach itself, where the dying was the heaviest and the desperate on was most complete and overwhelming, with some witnesses describing the figures as moving silently, deliberately, as if on a mission they will never complete, forever searching for something they lost or trying to warn others of the danger. Others report hearing battle sounds, the crack of gunfire from weapons long rusted away, the screams of dying men echoing from memory that begin and end inexplicably, lasting anywhere from a few seconds to several minutes, leaving witnesses uncertain of what they witnessed. The phenomenon is consistent enough that locals avoid certain sections of the beach, especially at twilight when the light is dim, and the boundary between the living and dead seems to blur into indistinct gradations of gray. Whether these are genuine spirits trapped by trauma or emo, tynal imprints burned into the landscape by extreme suffering and loss of life. The beach at Dieppe carries a weight that visitors immediately recognize and feel pressing down upon them, and many report leaving the location with a sense of sadness and loss that persists for days afterward. Verdun. From February to December of 1916, the Battle of Verdun raged across the hills of northeastern France in an unrelenting campaign of attrition. And when the smoke finally cleared, more than 700,000 soldiers had been killed or wounded in a battle that had no strategic objective beyond the destruction of human life itself. The battlefield, once heavily forested, was transformed into a barren moonscape of trenches and shell holes during the fighting. And though the forest has somewhat recovered in the centuries since the destruction, the ground remains scarred and broken in ways that seem to reflect the spiritual damage as much as the physical damage. Visitors to Verdun report an overwhelming sense of oppression and dread, a feeling of heaviness that seems to press down from the sky itself, making it difficult to breathe properly, and many experience what can only be described as empathic resonance with the soldiers who died in that particular location. The forest at Verdun is remarkably quiet, unusually so for a woodland area that should be alive with birdsong, and visitors report that their voices sound muffled and distorted, as if the ground itself is absorbing sound and preventing normal acoustic propagation. Some paranormal investigators have reported unusual electromagnetic readings in certain areas of the battlefield, surges of energy that appear and disappear without any discernible pattern or logical explanation for their occurrence or departure. There are also scattered reports of apparitions in soldiers' uniforms from different eras, figures less white, unpeased between the trees that vanish when approached or looked at directly, and the persistent sound of artillery fire in the distance, audible but impossible to locate or trace to any source whatsoever. Whether Verdun is genuinely haunted or whether the sheer scale of suffering and loss has created a psychological and emotional imprint that affects all who visit the location is debatable, though the consistency of reports suggests something genuinely paranormal is occurring. Gallipoli. In 1915, the Australian and New Zealand forces, along with British and French troops, attempted to capture the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey as part of a broader strategy in World War I, and the campaign became a brutal stalemate that lasted months, killing over 100,000 soldiers in total from disease, wounds, and combat. The campaign is particularly significant in Australian and New Zealand history, carrying national significance that has endowed the battlefields with cultural weight and emotional resonance that extends far beyond the historical facts themselves. Visitors to Gallipoli, especially from Australia and New Zealand who journey thousands of miles to visit, report profound emotional reactions. Overwhelming sadness, unexplained grief that seems to arise from nowhere, and in some cases, visitors report hearing voices that seem to be calling to them from across time, drawing them deeper into the landscape mysteriously. The beaches where soldiers landed are said to be particularly active paranormally, with reports of seeing soldiers wading through the surf, their uniforms soaked with blood and seawater, moving with the slow determination of the dying or wounded. Temperature variations occur unexpectedly and without meteorological cause, and some visitors report sensing the presence of specific individuals, even receiving impressions of their names and home locations from across the centuries. The connection between the living visitors and the dead soldiers seems stronger at Gallipoli than at many other battle sites, possibly because so many visitors journey to the location specifically to honor and remember those who died there, creating an intense emotional field that may amplify paranormal activity and make spirits more capable of manifesting or communicating. The Somme. The Battle of the Somme, fought from July to November of 1916, resulted in approximately 1 million casualties, making it the costliest battle in human history in terms of combined casualties, a distinction it holds with grim certainty and no contest. The rate of death was so staggering that entire units were annihilated in the space of a few hours of intense fighting, and soldiers went over the top, knowing with near certainty that they would be killed by machine gun fire before reaching the enemy trenches. The Somme is less frequently reported as a paranormal hotspot compared to other locations, yet the reports that do emerge from the site are among the most disturbing and suggest something truly extraordinary occurring beneath the surface. Visitors describe overwhelming sensations of despair and futility that seem to seep from the very earth. And some have reported witnessing what they describe as a continuous procession of soldiers moving toward an unseen enemy, their expressions fixed in grim determination or abject terror, as if still caught in the moment of attack. The sounds of battle seem to echo through certain areas of the battlefield in ways that military historians cannot explain or rationalize using conventional science, with witnesses reporting that the sounds match precisely with accounts from soldiers' letters and diaries written a century prior, as if the sounds are exact replicas. Some visitors report that their sense of time becomes confused at Somme, and they cannot accurately account for the duration of their visit. Trips that they believed lasted mere minutes turn out to have taken hours, or vice versa, with no logical explanation. This temporal distortion is consistent enough that paranormal researchers have begun to theorize that extreme trauma and mass death may actually warp the physical properties of space and time in localized art, as creating zones where normal causality breaks down and past and present merge together into something neither wholly past nor present. Aughrim. In 1691, a battle fought at Aughrim in Ireland was so brutal, so devastating to the native Irish population, that it has been called the most brutal battle ever fought on British soil in terms of the proportion of casualties, with up to 7,000 casualties in a single engagement. The folklore surrounding Aughrim is less documented than some other battlefields, partly because the event occurred in Ireland and was not widely chronicled in English records, meaning much of the history was suppressed or forgotten. But locals have consistently reported hearing the screams of dying soldiers echoing across the land, especially in areas surrounding the former battlefield during certain times of year. The haunting at Aughrim seems to be less about visual apparitions and more about Idory phenomena with a distinctly haunting and mournful quality, with witnesses describing agonized screams, battle cries in Irish and English, and the sounds of clashing weapons that appear suddenly and without cause, as if time is reverting to the moment of the battle itself. Some theorists suggest that because Aughrim has received less historical attention than other battlefields in broader culture and historical consciousness, the emotional imprint may have manifested differently in pure sound rather than in visual manifestations, as if the voices of the dead are desperate to ensure they are not forgotten again by the living, determined to be heard despite centuries of silence and historical erasure. Conclusion. These 10 battlefields, scattered across continents and centuries, share a common thread that binds them together in ways that challenge our fundamental understanding of death, trauma, and the nature of physical reality itself in profound and unsettling ways. Whether the phenomena reported at these locations are genuine paranormal manifestations of trapped spirits, psychological responses to historical trauma imprinted upon the landscape, or products of suggestion and atmospheric conditions that mislead our perceptions, remains fundamentally unclear despite decades of investigation by researchers. However, the consistency of reports across different cultures, time periods, and independent witness populations with no knowledge of each other's accounts suggests that something real and measurable is occurring at these sites. The mechanisms by which ancient battles could leave paranormal imprints remain theoretically problematic and resist explanation. How can human consciousness survive bodily death and persist in a location indefinitely? How can emotional energy become physically encoded into the landscape itself? Yet the reports persist across generations, and they persist with such striking similarity across independent witnesses that dismissing them as mere coincidence or shared delusion becomes increasingly difficult and intellectually dishonest. Some researchers have proposed theories involving electromagnetic imprinting, suggesting that the massive release of electrical energy during violent deaths could create permanent alterations in the Earth's magnetic field that sensitive individuals might perceive as paranormal phenomena or communication from spirits. Others suggest that traumatic death creates something akin to a groove or scar in the fabric of reality itself, a wound that never fully heals and through which past events continue to bleed into the present, breaking down the barriers between timelines. Still others maintain that the phenomena are entirely psychological in origin, that human beings are simply so deeply moved by the tragedy of battlefields that they unconsciously project their expectations onto ambiguous scenery. Sorry data, seeing soldiers in shadows and hearing voices in wind and rustling leaves. But what cannot be disputed or explained away is that these places carry unmistakable weight, that visitors to them experience genuine and measurable alterations in their emotional and psychological states, and that some visitors have documented encounters and physical evidence that seem to exceed the boundaries of normal experience and rational explanation. The dead at Gettysburg, Antietam, Culloden, and the other locations discussed here died in fear, pain, and confusion, often not understanding why they were dying or whether their deaths would mean anything in the broader scope of human history. If consciousness persists after death, if trauma can leave permanent marks upon the world, then these battlefields are perhaps exactly what we should expect to find. Places where the boundaries between past and present grow thin and permeable, where the voices of the forgotten rise again, and where the living are reminded, in ways both subtle and unmistakable, that they walk upon ground sanctified by suffering and loss. The question is not whether these battlefields are haunted, but rather what we are willing to accept as evidence of that haunting, and what responsibility we bear to acknowledge and honor those whose deaths created the paranormal phenomena that witnesses continue to report to this day. Perhaps the real mystery is not whether the battlefields are haunted, but why so many of us are determined to doubt what others have experienced, to rationalize and explain away the extraordinary, the testimony of countless witnesses across time and distance. The battlefields exist, the deaths occurred, and the phenomena are reported consistently and persistently. Whether we choose to acknowledge the reality of the haunting is perhaps less important than whether we choose to remember the fallen.